Thank you for being here. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Thursday morning Torah class. Wednesday, well, it is Thursday morning Torah class. It's just on Wednesday. Okay. So, the last time, very loud. The last time, I hope Roy can still pick that up and it still comes on through the Facebook, even though it's not quite so loud as the microphone would have me be. Let me just make sure that we're getting it on the stream. In any case, hasn't started yet, but all right. The last time we talked in general about the book of Exodus, and this time, though, we are headed back sort of to the regular Torah reading, and although we are, since we don't have that many classes left, I want to speak more about general themes than about the particular parsha, and right today I want to focus on the time that we are in the calendar as opposed to the parsha that we're on in the Torah, and that is we're in the midst of the Omer, and the Omer, which is a counting of 50 days between Passover and Shavuot, has both a historical and a theological significance. An agricultural one, because one is the barley harvest and then Shavuot is the wheat harvest, and also, and that's why the two holidays, like all the three Regilim, all the festival holidays have agricultural as well as historical ties, and why you can trace all these holidays to earlier pre-Israelite holidays as well, because they all have agricultural holidays are universal all over the world, right? At the time of harvest, there's a holiday. At the time of planting, there's a holiday, and so on, because that was the cycle of life. Yesterday in the Lunch and Learn, we talked about the fact that idolatry was primarily a phenomenon of fertility, that you have all these fertility idols because the two things that you had to depend on were rain, agriculture, and fertility that you couldn't control. And obviously also because between the rain fertilizing the soil and a man fertilizing a woman, there are a lot of analogies and connections that are made throughout sacred literature and literature in general. But also, there is this historical tie between the time that you leave Egypt and the time that you come to Sinai. And Passover to Shavuot, that passage of 50 days, is not only the time that it took in theory for the Israelites to walk from the second side of the Nile, of the river, to Mount Sinai, which, by the way, if that were true, you realize that by the time they got to Sinai, they were like very close to Israel, even though they were still 39 years and 10 months away from actually entering the land. But they were very close. Anyway, that they come to Sinai to receive the Torah, and there are all sorts of kavanot, all sorts of religious, devotional intentions that are supposed to help people get their souls from Passover to Shavuot to grow along with the Israelites' step-by-step ascent to Mount Sinai. And there is also this idea that the liberation from Israel was in order to go to Sinai. We tend in the modern world to think about liberation as something that is totally, you were in shackles and now you're out of shackles. But in the Jewish tradition, the liberation was specifically so that the Israelites could go to Sinai, which is why, even though it's not so pleasant for us to think about, the truth is that freedom as an ideal is not really so much a biblical emphasis. I won't say it isn't a biblical ideal because you have it in Leviticus, right? Proclaim freedom throughout the land and to all the inhabitants thereof. It's on the Liberty Bell. And it does exist in the Torah, but the story of the Exodus isn't really a story about slavery and freedom alone. It's a story about slavery and freedom too. This is a distinction that Isaiah Berlin, the Jewish, Russian, English philosopher, used to make, that there is negative freedom and positive freedom. Negative freedom is liberation from something, like if you're in jail and you're liberated, you have been given negative freedom. You are no longer restrained. Positive freedom is the ability to do something. So I don't have the positive freedom right now, for example, to play the violin because I can't do it. But if I took violin lessons, that would make me weirdly more free. And therefore, freedom requires a certain discipline because you have to learn things. So the idea behind it in the Torah is you learn this discipline in order to be spiritually free. And that's why in the Torah, right after the Revelation, what you get the Revelation has the 10 Commandments, which are both negative and positive, and then you get Mishpatim, which are all these different regulations when an ox gores a man or a woman and so on and so forth. And the reason that is so is something that I actually was to me very interesting in a podcast I just heard, which fits very well with the Torah. It was Robert Kaplan, who's a historian, political theorist. He wrote a book called Balkan Ghosts that had a big impact on the Clinton administration when the war was happening in Bosnia. He's written a bunch of other books. And he was talking about why he got Iraq wrong, why it is that he thought Iraq was a good idea and it turned out to be not such a good idea. And his answer was that he thinks he made the same mistake he said that a lot of elites make. We understand the dangers of authoritarianism, but we don't understand the dangers of chaos. And chaos is actually worse than authoritarianism. Because he said when he actually went to places like Iraq and saw what chaos was, that there was no one in charge and anyone could do whatever they wanted. And you were in constant fear, not of some central authority and you knew what the rules were and you had to obey them, but there were no rules. That was the worst. And you realize that when you take up people and they're in the desert and you want them to have order and freedom, you have to give them a lot of laws in order to fight back the chaos, especially in a desert where there are no natural boundaries. And in some ways, I suppose, this is what the story of human civilization is a greater and greater and greater march towards order while trying to balance it with freedom. But of the two, of absolute freedom, i.e. chaos and order, I think most human beings work better in order, because otherwise it's a predatory world. So this is what it says in Pirkei Avot, in the Ethics of the Fathers, that pray for the welfare of the government. Were it not for the government, people would swallow one another alive. So our ancestors knew what chaos was like. And so what you get in the progress from Egypt to Sinai is not so much slavery to freedom as it is authoritarian order to whatever a theocratic order, which is freer and more nurturing of human potential and all of those sorts of things. Because any free society is going to have constraints. And that is certainly true for a society built on the Torah, which is going to have lots of constraints, as we see, as I said, in Mishpatim, and the following parshiot. And in fact, the reason that the Israelites build the golden calf, of course, is because there's not enough order. All of a sudden, Moses has disappeared, and they're afraid again, and they're going to get swallowed up by the possible chaos of the desert. So that was the principal point that I wanted to make about the time of year. And about the Torah readings, what we're reading now is Tzav, Shmini, Leviticus, which is the least spiritually elevating for most of us of all the Torah portions. But they deal with the service of the temple and the way the priests diagnose diseases and so on, which is a kind of continuation of this order, but it continues it in the land, because all of the stuff that's in Leviticus presumes that the Israelites are in Israel and they're at the temple and they're making sacrifices and they have a priestly order. All of that is a sort of increase of order from the chaos of the desert to the place where they are in Israel. Okay, so I'm going to stop there. I have one more slight theme to pursue, but I'm going to stop there because I'm going to make a bit of a break and ask if there are questions or comments, and I'll take a look if there are online as well. Gave me a link to something, but I'm not going to click the link because who knows. Any questions about anything so far? Go ahead. I don't remember if it says it literally, explicitly that way. I think it says on the 50th day they arrived. So 1 second, I will tell you it's 20. On the third day, see if we can find it. On the third new moon after the Israelites had gone forth from the land of Egypt. So that's after 2 months, basically. So that's, what's that? That's chapter 19 in the Parsha is Yitro, chapter 19, verse 1. On the third day, new moon, after the Israelites had gone forth from the land of Egypt, on that very day, they entered the wilderness of Sinai. Which I guess by the wilderness of Sinai, they mean that section of the wilderness, as opposed to the wilderness in general. Anyway, so anything else about that? No. Okay, so then I wanted to talk for a minute about the service in the temple and what it meant in ancient times, and how much we don't realize that our religion is a very different religion from the biblical religion. The reason that there is so much in the Torah about service in the temple, and also why it is that people who are deeply Torah centered Jews are focused on the temple and the restoration of the temple and sacrifices in the temple, Because if you look at the Talmud, a lot of the Talmud is about sacrifices in the temple. Is that, like I think most ancient religions, ancient Judaism was actually about the temple, not about the book. The Torah as a book, whenever it was consolidated, was not, remember, first of all, it was very hard to come by. You didn't have books in everyone's home. It wasn't like you could just consult it or read it. Even if people were literate, the reasons we read Torah on Monday and Thursday, remember, is because those were market days. And that was when everybody gathered. So that was when you read the Torah, and people could hear it because they didn't have it at home to read it. I remember, in fact, this is already far developed from that, but when I was in rabbinical school, I took a seminar at Columbia with David Weiss Halivni, who was a great Talmud scholar, just passed away in Israel. And he quoted some Talmudic authority, and the authority had not from the time of the Talmud, from the Middle Ages, a scholar from the Middle Ages, and this scholar from the Middle Ages misquoted the Talmud. And when we asked him why, he said to us, "How many of you have a Talmud in your room, in your dorm rooms?" And we all did. He said, "How many of you have more than one?" And several of them have more than one, because these were all Talmud PhD students. And he said, "This man didn't have a Talmud in his entire town." He was quoting from memory. So that, when you think about that, and here we're talking about a scholar, the average ancient Israelite never saw a printed Torah, never saw a scroll of Torah, heard it read. And so the tangible center of their faith was the temple. And you can imagine, if you think about it, in an ancient world where you don't have things as impressive as now, the temple and the priests and the clothes that the priests wore and the bringing of sacrifices was an incredibly powerful and impressive event, especially when you consider that sacrifices were in front of your eyes. An animal that you had raised from infancy is slaughtered to God, which is a really powerful thing. And I have to say, prayer is a fairly pale substitute for sacrifice in terms of emotional power. In fact, the only thing that I can think of that begins to approach the emotional power of sacrifice in our day is a brit milah, is a boy's circumcision, which is why everybody is so uncomfortable when boys are circumcised, because it's the actual cutting of flesh, which is much more symbolically powerful than standing there and saying words or singing. So with all of this, the book of Leviticus especially, but not only the book of Leviticus, is devoted to what was for a long time the central worship of the Jewish people, which is why when the temple was destroyed the first time, it was such a catastrophe. And when they rebuilt it, it was, again, the center of the Jewish world, and why today as well, if you ask somebody what's the center of the Jewish world, they point to the remnant of the temple, even though the idea that it will be rebuilt and they will sacrifice again might not be what everybody in this room thinks of as the religious sine qua non of Jewish tradition. But you can understand why it would be, and why the priests therefore had special status, and why even now you try to keep Kohanim separate so that if the temple comes back, they will be able to serve again. And that's what all the laws of purity of Kohanim are about. That's why they're not supposed to go into graveyards. That's why they're not supposed to, there are laws in the Jewish tradition about a Kohen not marrying a divorcee or things like that, because Kohanim are supposed to keep a special level of purity in order to serve in the temple. And that's the part of the portion that we are reading about right now. And there isn't in the Torah's mind so much of a division between the laws that we think of as applicable, like 6 days you work and the 7th day you rest, and the laws of bringing a sacrifice to the temple, because all of them were actually identical laws of God about serving in the way that God brought us out of Egypt to serve, which is a spiritual service as opposed to a physical slavery. All right, so, and by the way, if you look on page, in chapter 25 of Leviticus, it says, it talks about the sabbatical. When you enter the land shall observe a Sabbath of the Lord. 6 years you sow, and 6 years you prune and gather in the field. But the seventh year, a land shall have a Sabbath of complete rest. This is Leviticus chapter 25. But what I want to point out is, in verse 8, it says, you shall count off 7 weeks of years, 7 times 7 years. So the period of 7 weeks of years gives you a total of 49 years. And then the 50th is what? The sabbatical year. And this is also a religious model for the Omer, because the Omer is 7 weeks of 7, and then the 50th is Shavuot. So if you ask me, was it actually 50 days from the exit? It's a very typological number, like 40 days and 40 nights and 40 years in the desert. 50 is also for the sabbatical and for the time when you come to Mount Sinai to receive the Torah. All right, questions, comments? Please, Esther. That is a great question. What did they do with somebody who didn't want to perform sacrifice? So it was a tax, because also the priests ate the sacrifices. So you had different kinds of sanctions at different times of history, but the difference between a traditional society like that and our society was you were entirely dependent on people who knew you very well and knew everything you did. And so if you did that, the people around you would shun you, and you would literally not be able to survive. Yes, the pigeons of ancient Israel were very lucky. So, I mean, but it really is an interesting thing that one of the I haven't actually thought so much about this, but one of the disadvantages of having a large society is you can violate the rules with a lot less consequence. Because if you have a really close-knit society, everybody knows what everyone is doing. And therefore, if you do something wrong, your entire community is not going to make it easy for you. My favorite story about this, which you may or I've told before, but I'll tell it again, is the one that Eliezer Shlomovic told me, which is, you know that after a woman has her period, she's supposed to go to the mikveh before she can have sex with her husband again, right? According to traditional Jewish laws of family purity. So there was a guy in his village that refused to give tzedakah. He didn't want to give any money. So they didn't let his wife go to the mikveh. Seriously, that was it. I said, what happened? He said, he gave the money. That was their punishment. Because it's like when everyone knows everyone, you have very easy sanctions on people who want to give you a hard time. So I thought that was just,
I can add something to that.
Please.
My father-in-law,
Wow. Hertha said who was it, your father-in-law? Father-in-law, who his daughter made aliyah illegally with Hashomer Hatzair, and so the father was not allowed to come to the temple. Because it was very common to punish the parents for what the kids did. Max Webb told that story, that in Lodz, he skipped school one day and they put his father in jail for a day because he skipped school. And okay, but the end of that story is he said he never felt so guilty in his life. I said, I'll bet you never skipped school again. He goes, yeah, I did. He just tried to make sure people didn't find out about it. But, I mean, we think of everybody, you know, in Eastern Europe as like being perfect angels. But, you know, people are people. People are people. So, any other questions? If not, I hope you will forgive me. I'm going to end a couple of minutes early this morning, and because we have an early staff meeting. And I want to thank you for coming, and I look forward to seeing you next week for a new Thursday morning Torah class on Wednesday.
I won't be here. I'm leaving for Israel.
That's a good excuse. That is a good excuse.